Okay, so this is the third video related to industry analysis. I'm going to teach you one framework that is useful for understanding an industry, and we call this Porter's 5 Forces, named after the professor at Harvard who made this analysis popular. There are 5 forces. You'd see this in a strategy class. Again, this is to describe whether an industry is attractive. Now, you're not a corporate strategist that's deciding which industry to get into, which is the reason that this framework was developed. But you are an entrepreneur that needs to know whether the industry you think you're going to be in is actually attractive. Now, there may be things that you can do to make it more attractive, but you can't just avoid the fact that some industries are not attractive. For example, a lot of times students come to class and they want to do a restaurant. That's not a very attractive industry. A lot of restaurants fail, and there's a reason for that. And so, while there are many restaurants that are performing well, we just have to know, we have to be able to understand why some industries are more attractive than others. And these 5 forces help us to understand that. So the first one is threat of new entrants, bargaining power of buyers, threat of substitute products or services, bargaining power of suppliers, and rivalry among existing competitors. So basically, you don't want any threats, and you don't want bargaining power to be, you want bargaining power of your buyers and suppliers to be low, and low rivalry. But that doesn't always happen. So let's go through and talk about this with the automobile manufacturing as the example. So the first thing that I want to have you think about is how to understand these forces. It's important because, again, you're not a strategist choosing an industry to enter. You're actually kind of stuck in an industry if you're analyzing a specific type of business. But the image that I want you to think about is this guy here, if you can recognize him. This is from Gulliver's Travels, and he goes to different lands, and in one land he's a giant. As you can see, there's a bunch of little people here, and they think he's a giant. In another land, he is the little person, and he's looking up to giants. So the reason I mention this is that you should think of yourself just magically dropped into the industry, and then you're describing what's around you. So you assume that you're already there. You have to assume that you're already there to be able to remember how to do this right. And then you're going to assess the strength of these competitive forces and assess the factors causing them, and then kind of rate it. This is important because it's confusing if you're an entrepreneur not yet in the industry. Your perspective would be different, but in order to describe the industry, you have to assume that you're already in the industry, and then you're describing what it's like there. So, bargaining power. So, using the bargaining power of buyers. So, using the example of automobile manufacturers, you can see here there's various examples of bargaining power. So, for example, think of the different types of buyers out there. There's car dealers, wholesalers, exports, leasing companies, and government. Do they have very much bargaining power with automobile manufacturers? Well, they do have some, because they do purchase a sizable amount of the industry's product. Potentially they could integrate backwards, meaning that they could start manufacturing themselves. One thing that's true about cars is that you can the buyer of the car can choose to get a different type of car next time. So they're not necessarily locked into one type of car. And they can purchase from several sellers. So all of these points, if you assess them, and I have some check marks there where it seems to be important, that says that car manufacturing, the buyer bargaining power is moderately high, which, you don't want the buyers to have much bargaining power. And you don't want suppliers to have very much bargaining power. You can see several different factors here, but for manufacturing, car manufacturing, you have to think of the suppliers as not just the suppliers, the original equipment manufacturers that give parts, but also the government, which gives them the ability to operate, and also labor. And in this case, labor is very important, especially here in the U.S., in that the employees of a car manufacturer are unionized, and so therefore they have more power with a union. And for that reason alone, supplier bargaining power in the automobile manufacturing industry is high. Then the third force that we'll look at is the forces of rivalry. I think it kind of makes sense that you don't want other competitors you don't want a lot of rivalry, because then there is going to be, as it mentions here, are there a lot of new products or new marketing campaigns to gain more sales and market share, and typically that is aggressive. They drop prices, and that's not good because that erodes your profitability. So that makes it less costly. And this is particularly important if there's low switching costs. So if you can switch between different types of products or services, then rivalry is really important. And in car manufacturing, that rivalry is moderate to high. Threat of entry. So any entry barriers, and there's multiple different types of entry barriers. I'll mention a few here. Supply side economics, scale economics, is that you need to get to really large numbers of products or services before you can actually make something economically. So for example, if you want to build your first car, you have to build the whole manufacturing plant. You have to develop a lot of knowledge and learning. It's really hard to start an automobile manufacturing company because of the supply side scale economies. Similarly, for demand side scale economies, that's difficult too, because you have to have a way of distributing all of these cars, and that takes, for the first one to distribute, it's really hard. Another example is strong learning experience curve effects, meaning that when you are doing something for the first time, you don't do a very good job. Now that's true, particularly true in automobiles. That we also have regulatory policies, tariffs. All of these factors add up to entry barriers. And if you're in an industry, you want the entry barriers to be high so that you don't have much more threat of entry. So overall, entry barriers are high for automobile manufacturers. That's great for the existing manufacturers. Not good for the ones that are trying to get in, but it's great because that means that there's less competition. And then there could be substitutes. So those are things that are available, priced attractively, and have to have comparable performance. So automobile manufacturer's low to moderate threat of substitutes. You can take a bus or high-speed transportation or something. So you add all these 5 forces together, low to moderate threat of new entrants, high bargaining supply of power of suppliers, moderate to high bargaining power of buyers, low threat of substitutes, high rivalry, and then that will give you kind of a composite view of whether the industry is attractive. In this case, automobile manufacturing is low to moderately attractive, largely because of the bargaining power of suppliers, bargaining power of buyers, and high rivalry. Now there are a few things that you can do to try to limit these factors. You could integrate vertically, meaning that you could go and buy out your suppliers. You could identify a new niche market where you have fewer competitors. You could create switching costs so that they can't really, it's a pain to try to find a substitute. And you could try to develop economies of scale so that potential new entrants can't come in and really compete that well. So just because it doesn't look super attractive right now doesn't mean you can't compete in an industry, but it is something that you have to think about to make your strategy for your company work. Okay, so you can think about applying this to your own business. We won't do that right now, but you could think about that. I don't really want you to do a Porter's 5 forces analysis with a diagram and stuff in the business plan, but you definitely should think about this, and you could mention it briefly in the business plan about how attractive the industry is. Here's a few graphics that I thought were kind of interesting. As I told you, and I will tell you in multiple of these videos, a business plan should look closer to a brochure, not like an English essay. So you should be using infographics, things like this, to illustrate your points about the industry or your market. Here's another one, another infographic that I thought was kind of useful. So I just want to try to inspire you to think more graphically as you try to represent some of the information that you're going to provide in your business plan. Okay, so key takeaways: industry affects firm profitability. So it's comparative. You can't compare across industries. You have to do it within the industries. And you do really need to know the industry. Some are less attractive, and you have to confront this in the business plan. All right, that's it.